Okay, so we are going to, in our Stronger series that we've been doing all year, we're going to spend at least 5 weeks studying Stronger in Grace. Now, I'll go ahead and say this. If you can't get fired up about studying grace for 5 weeks, check your pulse. Something's wrong, because this is a fun subject. It's a great subject. I think there are some reasons that we need to study this as a church, and that's what I'm going to set this up with this morning. Funny, in all of our subjects that we're studying, this is the one that there is a direct biblical command to do, right? 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1, Paul says, be strong in grace. Now, a funny thing, if you think through that, what does that imply? You can be weak in grace, right? If Paul is giving an admonition to Timothy to say, Timothy, be strong in grace, some of us sitting here this morning may need to hear that because we may need to strengthen our lives in grace. And that's what we hope over these 5 weeks we're going to do. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to spend 5 weeks, taking spiritual dessert every week. You follow me on that? We hear grace, we go, oh, that's so easy. I think grace is a lot harder than we think it is. I think we're going to be a little bit shocked at some of the things that grace does. Grace is not just eye candy. It's not just, oh, wow, God gives me everything I want and never does anything challenging in my life. And so today we're going to kind of set that up. Grace is something that you live in. It's not a concept of the Bible. Grace is this thing that envelops you and you live in it. And I hope we broaden our minds and our thoughts about grace over the next 5 weeks, that we go, wow, grace just isn't that nice little, thing God did for us when Jesus died on the cross. And we all love grace because we're saved by grace. Grace is so much deeper than that. And there's so much more to unpack. And so let me start it off this morning with sharing 4 things of why I believe we need to study grace. Number 1, grace reveals the mind and the nature of God. You want to know who God is, then you need to study grace. Now, I got a question. If you took my 2 Timothy class, do not answer this out loud. All right? Where did this idea of grace begin? That's a great question to start off with. We kind of know about law in the Old Testament and how God set that up, and we know when Jesus came along, but where did this idea of grace start in the first place? Anybody know? You should have come to the 2 Timothy class. All right, turn over there, 2 Timothy chapter 1, and I just find this to be an amazing verse. I don't know. It's kind of a mind-blowing verse. You got to stop for a minute and think it through. 2 Timothy chapter 1, starting in verse 8. So do not be ashamed to testify about our Lord, or ashamed of me, his prisoner, but join with me in suffering for the gospel by the power of God, who has saved us and called us to a holy life, not because of anything we have done, but because of his own purpose and grace. This grace was given us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. Think about what that verse says. Think about what it teaches us about the heart and the mind of God. That God, before he ever created the earth, before he ever created humans, us, he knew what he was going to do. I'm going to create the world. I'm going to create humans in my likeness, and I'm going to give them free will. I'm not creating robots. They are going to be able to choose to either love me or not love me. And the fact is, God knew before he created us what we would do. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm God, I might go to plan B. I might go, well, why would I create this whole mass of people that are going to reject me and ultimately kill my son on a cross? I'm pretty sure I would change the plan. But instead, the heart and the mind of God is, before the beginning of the creation of the world, God says, I'm going to shower upon their lives grace. Because that's who I am. Because it's how I work. It's my heart. God is grace. We need to dig into that a little bit more. We need to understand this idea of God creating grace before He created human people. Because that's who He is. Number two, why do we need to study grace? Because grace is a unique concept in world religion. I don't know what religions come to your mind as you start looking at world religions and all the different things that those religions teach. With Jews, you have the law. With Buddhists, you have the Eightfold Path. With Islam, you have the pillars of Islam, and then, of course, the escape from perpetual rebirth. And there are just, reaching enlightenment and all the things that all the world religions teach. But there's not one of those religions that does what Christianity does. It's what makes it unique. That the God and the Creator of the universe sacrifices Himself for what He has created. That's a crazy thought right there, isn't it? And it's what separates Christianity from any other religion of the world, this idea of grace, that God looks favorably on His people. He doesn't just do nice things for them, He sacrifices Himself in their place. An amazing reason that we need to study the grace of God, because that grace then gives us hope. It gives us confidence that I've got a God who's not looking to treat me hard or bad, or you better do it this way or else. He's willing to lay down His life. And He chooses to be that way, different from any other religion in the world. Number three, grace is just hard to define. That's one of the reasons that we need to dig into this a little bit more. Now, I don't know what you grew up with, but I grew up with a couple of definitions of grace. One is unmerited favor. Okay, that's nice. It's good. The other is an acronym, GRACE, God's riches at Christ's expense. Nice way of remembering that. But as I look at those definitions of grace, I go, those are fine, they're okay, but they're inadequate. Because they seem to only be focusing on one part of God's grace. And so let's just take a story out of the Bible for a second. Y'all know the story of Paul, right? The amazing man that he was, and he went through a lot, and he was struck blind on the road to Damascus to see Jesus personally. And later, as his ministry goes, and he's doing, all these amazing things and planting churches, he's got a problem in his life. And it's a very significant problem. We don't know exactly what it is. We think it might be that he was blind or close to blind. And Paul, whatever the infirmity was, Paul begs God 3 times. And I believe these are times of prayer that Paul, just begs God to say, God, come on, take this away from me. And what was God's answer? My grace is sufficient. Now, let's be honest. Do you think Paul was thinking at the time, wow, I feel unmerited favor from God? because I'm blind and he won't make it go away. I don't think that's what Paul felt. Do you think Paul felt God's riches? Am I getting rich off of this? Is this blessing my life? No, it is challenging my life, and God answers by saying, my grace is sufficient for you. Grace is a lot more encompassing of our lives than just, I get some unmerited favor. And so we're going to dig a little bit more into getting a deeper understanding of what God's grace really is in our lives. Sometimes grace does some pretty tough stuff. My two oldest children sitting in the sound booth back there working. I think if you ask them, overall, were your parents gracious in your life, they would probably say a resounding yes. But you could also ask them, did it always feel like grace? I guarantee you, there were plenty of days. Why? Because grace is this overwhelming and overlooking, arching thing that we live inside of in our lives. And it's not all candy and it's not all this. And some of us are going to have to rethink even how God's grace works in our lives. But that's probably, for those of you that have kids, that might be a great place to start. Because you know you love them and you would do anything for them. You would lay down your life for them, wouldn't you? But sometimes what you do in their life doesn't feel like grace. That's God's grace. And Rick Fuller, what an appropriate sharing here a while ago to go. There you go, right there. Look at how God's overlooking of his life has always been there. That is grace. We got to broaden the way we think about grace. And then fourthly, a shallow understanding of grace will lead us to some destructive places. So if you're sitting here this morning and you kind of have this, Disney view of grace, and it's just, it's this great thing God did and it just covers everything in life and I just go and do as I like, and that's, you'll get to some dangerous places. Like what we call cheap grace. A terminology you've heard, and basically, cheap grace, and we'll dig in. I think Clayton's doing this lesson in a few weeks, right? So I'm not going to steal his thunder, but we're going to look in Romans 6 because it became a question in the Bible. Well, grace is grace, and grace covers sin, so let's just go out and sin more, and that'll make grace even bigger. That's cheapening grace. I'll just say this, guys. There's a movement in America today and in a lot of churches that we just don't want to talk about sin anymore. But that cheapens grace, because if I don't understand sin in my life, then why do I need grace? Well, Rick, I'm just living true to my own life. What's right for me is right for me. It might be wrong for somebody else, but I'm just living true to myself. And when we lose the definition of sin, we lose an appreciation for grace. What did Paul say? I am the chief, the worst of sinners. One whole lesson we're going to do is Paul and grace. If there ever was a man in the Bible that understood grace, it's Paul, particularly from a human point of view. I think Kyle's doing that lesson, and we're going to spend a whole day just looking at how Paul viewed grace. But he could see it that way because he understood who he was. And so don't buy into this resistance of, I just don't talk about sin or know anything about that, or, whatever, because you will cheapen grace. The sort of other end of that spectrum, in the dangerous places we get, this is a little bit more how I grew up, and some of you, if we have a shallow understanding of grace, we start trying to think it's about us. And we get into some weird thinking, man. I mean, some places we go that we start trying to earn salvation in some way. You see it in Catholicism. If you sin in Catholicism, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to go to the priest, and the priest will give you penance for your sin. You say some Our Fathers, some Hail Marys. If you've been really bad, maybe a bunch of them. That's a bad understanding of God's grace. Jesus paid it all on the cross. We don't need to do penance for forgiveness. Hey, here's the way I grew up. Literally, it was you've been baptized, you had your sins forgiven, and you come up out of the waters and you're saved. That's awesome. And then you're driving home and somebody pulls out in front of you and you haven't broken that habit yet, and you eke out a bad word. Ooh, now I don't feel saved anymore. So you rattle off a quick prayer and you say, oh God, forgive me. And now I feel saved again. And you walk in the front door and you're short with your wife and you haven't been a great husband and now you don't feel saved anymore. Anybody else done that yo-yo? I think there are a lot of us that, let's be honest, in our heritage, we aren't known for our great understanding of the grace of God. Discipleship, maybe you got a pretty good handle on that. Grace, we got a lot of room to grow in. It got so bad with guys that I went to school with that we had debates about what constitute, do you get credit for coming to church if you miss communion? You got to think that one through. So if I come to church and I come in late and we've already had communion, does it count? Chris Bailey's smiling. He knows, where this comes from. What if I don't stay for the sermon? Does that really count? Am I right with God? Do I have God's approval that I have served God because I showed up at church? Like some of us may come in that way sometimes. It's my duty. I'll show up and get my record of attendance in heaven checked. That's a cheap understanding of grace, but it leads us to some weird places. This last one I'm going to touch on might be perhaps the most challenging one. Let's go over there and read it. Turn to the book of Hebrews. I want to read this verse. Hebrews chapter 12. Starting in verse 14. If we have a shallow understanding of grace, we may find ourselves in some really dangerous territory. Make every effort to live in peace with all men and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one misses the grace of God and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. The Hebrew writer says, see to it. By the way, that's a pretty interesting word there. The word in Greek is episkop. Let me get the right ending on it. Episkopeo. It's a verb, and it says, see to it. Make it your business. Make sure this happens. If you hear that word and you go back just a little bit, you understand that episkopos is one of the words for elders. And this is a form of that word. And what he says is, and it's not just for elders there, it's for all of us, that as we look around the congregation, we need to episkopeo, we need to see to it. That means I got to love and care for my brother, my sister, my neighbor, my person in my family group to make sure that they do not miss the grace of God. How are people doing with grace that are in your life? Look around this room. Now, sometimes you can see it right here. There's just that look of bitterness, that look of anger, that look that grace is not enveloping their life. Sometimes it's deep down in here, and it's not so obvious. How are you feeling deep down? Do you feel close to God? Are you secure in your salvation? Is grace covering your life, or are you weak in grace? Because then the Hebrew writer says, here's what happens next. When you are not living in the grace of God, what happens? Somewhere, somehow, Satan is going to plant this little root in your life. It could be bitterness towards God because something didn't go the way you thought it should go. Or it's bitterness to a person on the same aisle as you or way over there, and that's why they're way over there and you're over here, because there's this little bitter root that's growing. Guys, that's a dangerous place to be, because then the third step, he says, is that bitter root will grow and it will defile many. You ever been around? I have, in 42 years of ministry, I've been around some people. I'll just be honest that you go, at the end of the day, if I could step back from their life, I would go, you know what it is? They just miss grace. They just hadn't gotten it. Because there's always a complaint, always a problem with a brother or sister. There's just somebody that's not living in grace. They're not feeling it. They're not living it. And that bitter root, and then boy, that bitter root gets in a church. I have watched many a church split, go through problems because bitter roots were allowed to fester. Could anything better be said about Triangle Church? Particularly as we end our year together, studying out grace, that people would say, this is a church that knows grace. One of the lessons we're going to do is grace with each other, grace in our relationships. What does that mean and what does it not mean? But I don't want to end up in Hebrews 12. I don't want to miss the grace of God. And that's why we're going to take 5 weeks and study it out. And we need to be asking one another, how are you studying grace? Are you feeling God's grace in your life? Because I don't want you to miss it. That's why we're taking this study up. Okay, so today's kind of an introduction. Let me tell you what we're going to do. Brian, you can make your way up. What we're going to do next week. Next week, we're going to take, I believe, the 3 greatest stories in the Bible about grace. And we're going to not only look at them, you can just read them and they make you feel great, but there are some great things that these 3 stories teach us about God's grace. And we'll do those 3 next Sunday morning. All right? Brian's going to close us out.